Hi. So let me introduce you first. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we got Dr. Sapna Marcus from AIMS Bhatinda. Dr. Marcus is Associate Professor in Radiation Oncology Department. She has kindly agreed to take this class of role of molecular imaging in oncology, and I requested her to talk something specific about its role in head and neck cancer. Dr. Marcus is one of the enthusiast academician, and I hope that all of you will enjoy this class. Dr. Sapna, please take this session forward. And thank you so much for participating with us.
Thank you, Dr. Dodal, for the kind words. And since I have got the opportunity, I would really like to thank you and appreciate your hard work and gesture for the teaching which you have, the hard work and the teaching which you have taken on your shoulders. So thank you once again for inviting me for this lecture. So not to waste much time in this, and I would really like to start the lecture with the role of molecular imaging in oncology and with special emphasis on head and neck cancer. So basically, we'll take the journey with the terminologies first, and then we will look forward to the evolving need for molecular imaging and the intensification of its need in head and neck cancer, the various MI modalities at hand which are present with us, the various challenges which we face when we are doing the molecular imaging at our departments, and the various initiatives which have been taken by molecular imaging in and its future perspectives. So terminology, when we take the two groups which have taken it together on their shoulders to define what is molecular imaging, is the American Association of Physicists in Medicine and the Working Group on Molecular Imaging in Radiation Oncology. So science whereby cells or biological as proteins or molecules are imaged or used to non-invasively image the biological structure or function at the molecular or cellular level. That is what is meant by molecular imaging. And it was basically defined or redefined, I would say, by Society of Nuclear Medicine and Molecular Imaging in 2005. So with few minor changes, they adapted the definition towards diagnostic and therapeutic application also. So why there is the ever evolving need in head and neck cancer? Because more than 50% of the patients are going to present to us with distant mets or already advanced disease. And CT and the MR imaging, basically they are variable in presenting patterns as well as intra-observer variances. Then the nodal size mets is also not very specific when we come to define on CT or MRI, because sizes as small as 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeter can also present with mets, and which always present a gray area or a controversial area when we try to report these areas. When we come to FDG PET, the tumor localization is little bit definitely better, but still the tumor uptake or the radiotracer uptake does have its own complications in this area. So what's wrong with conventional imaging that we have to jump to the molecular imaging? In CT and MRI, normal anatomy with variable enhancement is seen with CT and MRI. That's what I was trying to tell you in the previous slide also. And if we can incorporate the biological and the physiological function, like for example, the blood inflow and the oxygen rate, perfusion rate, all these factors, then definitely we get a better information about the tumor, and we can treat the tumor in a better way if we can get all the X, Y, Z of its, anatomy, as well as you can say the entire address of the tumor. So that's why it was not fully given on the CT and MRI. That's why we needed something more than the conventional imaging. And if we try to incorporate everything into CT and MRI, then we need multiple scans. So which is quite time consuming and exhausting. Then The molecular imaging also helps us in radiation treatment and planning. That we have already seen when we are trying to do IMRT or SBRT or adaptive radiotherapy. So molecular imaging modalities which are at hand right now are CT, MRI, ultrasound, optical imaging, which includes bioluminescence and fluorescence, and PET scan as well as SPECT scan. Now, to understand what actually molecular imaging uh, will be helpful in to us, in what way, we have to understand what is Gompardzian growth curve. I hope everybody is very much familiar with this curve. This curve, the orange area, basically defines the remission period or the subclinical period in which the tumor will not be palpable. And if you can image the tumor in this period or during this orange curve, then only the performance of your imaging modality is supposed to be very good. Otherwise, it's not. I hope you're getting my point. Are you? Can I
Yes,
get?
ma'am.
Okay, okay. Well, good. So now we have a blue dot which is saying angiogenic switch. At this point, the lag curve of the growth converts itself into the log curve. And at this is the same point at which the angiogenesis starts taking place. This occurs between 10 to the power 3 cells to 10 to the power 6 cells. Okay. So at this point, the angiogenic switch takes place and the rapidity of the multiplication of cells occurs. So this area, orange area, is very important. The lower the number of cells, and if those can be imaged by any kind of modality, then it will be the best for us. I hope everybody understands this. So I have given the kind of modality and the number of cells which are taken to diagnose a tumor. For example, in ultrasound, CT, and MRI, 1 microliter of cell is taken to diagnose or to resolute a cell. For example, these number of cells are needed in a typical voxel per pixel to show a resolution. I mean, then only we can differentiate in a tumor. Whereas in SPECT, the number of cells increases to 1.7 centimeter cube. In PET, it is 0.5 centimeter cube. In optical 2D, it is 0.01 millimeter cube. Whereas in optical 3D, it is 1 centimeter cube. So this thing should be very clear. Then how will you image the patient in a remission period? How will you image the patient when the tumor has already shown up? How will you image the patient when the tumor is progressing? So this thing should be very clear to you. This we have already seen. So I believe whenever you have to start something, you should always go by history. So history is our cyclotron. Cyclotron is the emitter of positron, which is used in our PET scans. And it has a half-life, the positron has a half-life of 1 minute to several days. And its existence was first postulated in 1928 by Paul Dirac. And the activity was first observed in 1932 by Carl D. Anderson, who named it as positron. So the concept of emission and transmission was introduced by David E. Kuhal. So this man was known as the father of emission tomography. So if you are asked who is the father of SPECT or PET scan, I think this name comes up because it was a very interesting feature when I was trying to find out who was the father of SPECT scan or PET scan. I think 5 or 6 fathers came out on the screen. So, I mean, after a lot of exclusion criteria taken out into consideration, David E. Kohal came out to be the name who comes out to be the father of emission tomography. And in the late 1970s, Tatsu Ido at the Brookhaven Laboratory was the first to describe the synthesis of FDG18, which was the molecule of the century. So we all know what is the principle of PET, that FDG with glucose co-transport is taken inside the cell, and with the enzyme hexokinase, it is converted into FDG6 phosphate, and then it is utilized by the glucose in the metabolizing cells. So this phosphate group is very difficult to take out from the cells now. So this is shown by the in the scan as the avid areas. So now this is a PET scan image. I mean a PET scan overview, you can say, where you can see a radio tracer being injected and a photon counter. A scanner is nothing but a photon counter, you can say. And a proton annihilation reaction takes place, and the photons which are traveling parallel, they are caught by the photon counter, and those the number of counters which take place, they are going to present the image on the scan. So how do we measure the radio tracer uptake? This is being measured by the standardized uptake value, and this is being calculated by tumor activity concentration, which is measured in megabecquerel per ml, divided by injected dose, which is also measured in megabecquerel, multiplied by body weight. So evidence of PET in oncology, the most important evidence is in head and neck cancer, and rest is in lung cancer, melanoma, lymphoma, solitary pulmonary nodule, breast cancer, CRC, esophageal cancer, thyroid cancer, and cervical cancer. Now you can see a follicular lymphoma in which three kinds of cycles, chemo cycles have been given. In first cycle, you could see that the patient was still had the disease, was not showing remission. Mild remission, you could say, on the left side cervical node, and then he was put on to the second line, and again he was not showing much progress, and then on the third cycle he showed complete remission. Here you could see the miracle of PET scan, and in the CT scan we could not appreciate any growth in the nasopharynx area. There was slight bulge on the nasopharynx area, but we could not appreciate the anatomy of the nasopharynx area, as well as any nodes could not be seen. But if you can see on the PET scan, you can very easily see that it was not a small bulge, but it was quite a big bulge of in the nasopharynx, as well as a small node in the retropharyngeal area. Now, these are small nodes which could have easily been lost in the cervical cancer in the retroperitoneal area, but they were easily picked up by the PET scan in CS cervix. This is also, you could measure the response to R-CHOP, especially in lymphomas. PET has acted as a big gift to radiation oncologists for reviewing or for interim analysis of chemotherapy progression of the disease during chemotherapy cycles. Now, what are the limitations of PET? First is that the cost of cyclotron definitely acts as a limiting factor in PET scans. Then the radio tracer has to be made on the site, and then there are traveling issues, then the transportation issues, then the half-life issues of FDG only 110 minutes. And then there are non-specific cancer avidity sites also, like inflammation or benign disease. So all these are limitations of PET. Now, history of SPECT. Again, David E. Cole, which we have already seen in the PET. He was the father of emission tomography, and this was among the first SPECT machines. We can see him working with that. and he was a psychiatrist, researcher, and author. Now, where does SPECT fit in the CT? CT is divided into emission tomography and transmission tomography. So PET and SPECT actually fall into emission tomography, and X-ray CT and gamma ray CT fall into transmission tomography. Now the difference between is, in emission tomography, the source is located inside the object, and in transmission tomography, source is located outside the object. Picture of SPECT, it looks very much like a CT or MRI machine, except that it has collimeters, it has a photomultiplier tube, and it has to be put very much close to the patient because to prevent scattering. And in the anterior picture, yes, and this is the SPECT, you can see a very small nodule at the anterior picture, but it can be very nicely visualized on the axial images. Here also you could see that there were some hepatic uptakes on the anterior picture, and there were few other uptakes in the abdomen. But when on axial images, you could see that those hepatic uptakes were definitely there, but there were some colon uptakes also. So advantages of SPECT are that it was definitely having an improved contrast and reduced structural noise. Localization of defects were much more precise. Extent and size is better defined, and image-free background. And SPECT and PET are the only non-invasive techniques in which we can actually image the biological aspect. It has a longer half-life and available in the developing countries. However, it also has its limitations and disadvantages like exposure, limited spatial and temporal resolution, and it is relatively expensive to build and not effective in the post-exercise group. Now, if we compare the SPECT and PET, which will be better? Definitely SPECT has lower resolution and sensitivity as compared to PET. Now SPECT, since I had told you in the diagram that it has collimators, so definitely it's going to lose or have attenuation because of the collimators. Then third, it does not have a uniform image. It does have a deterioration in the image from the edge towards the center, whereas in the PET we have a quite uniform image, especially at the center. And in the PET we usually have attenuation correction, which is absent in SPECT. And this is very obvious that SPECT is less expensive and non-invasive. Now MRI. The history of MRI, Dr. Rabi discovered NMR in the late 90s and considered it to be an artifact of his apparatus. Mr. Gorter coined the term NMR resonance, that is what we use right now, in 1942. And Bloch and Purcell, they won the Nobel Prize in 1952. This is the man who actually won the Nobel Prize for what we are having today. And he shared the Nobel Prize with Sir Paul Lauterbur and Sir Peter Mansfield. These are the two men who shared the prize for MRI along with the person I showed before. So on what principle the MRI works? MRI is based on the principle of nuclear magnetic resonance. And the two basic principles are that our bodies are made up of protons and they are unarranged. They are not arranged in the proper order. But if we are placed in a strong magnetic field, then this is what happens. And the protons actually, they get aligned in that strong magnetic field. So these are the upcoming, the upright MRIs. So the claustrophobia factor can be omitted in these kind of MRIs. Now these MRIs, we have the axial MRIs. And how can we differentiate between the axial MRIs? In one, the vessel, mainly the vessel will be dark, and in other, the vessel will be bright. So are you getting it, or am I too fast?
No,
Hello?
it's
No, ma'am.
perfect. It's perfect.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So axial T1 and axial T2, these are the two main films of MRI, which we sequences of MRI which we deal with. And axial T1 is useful for evaluating anatomic details, in which we will see black, gray, and white. White will be bone, gray will be the structures in between, and black will be the you can see the cisterns and the lacunae. So vessels will be dark. Yeah, vessels will be dark. So, and the other one, axial T2, is useful for looking edema and pathology. So axial T2 is also very helpful for us, in which CSF is bright, white matter is gray matter is light, and vessels are dark. So in both of these, the vessels will be dark. Now we come to functional MRI. Since the early 1990s, functional MRI has come, and it looks at the blood flow. So it measures the brain activity and detects the changes in blood oxygen flow. So here you can see the MRI scan and the functional MRI scan. So MRI views the anatomical structure, whereas a functional MRI views the metabolic functions. It focuses on the protons and hydrogen nuclei. It calculates the oxygen level. The MRI has high spatial resolution, which is not there in functional MRI. And it is used for experimental purposes, which is lacking in functional MRI. Advantages are definitely, we all know that it is non-invasive, and it does not have no ionizing radiation, and we can always reconstruct the images. For example, we take axial, but then we can always have sagittal and coronal images also. Then many details can be present without IV contrast, and definitely a good resolution. Then disadvantages of MRI are it's very expensive. It's dangerous for patients with metallic clips and any kind of metallic implants, and difficult to be performed in claustrophobic patients, and movements during scanning may cause blurry images, and RF transmitters may cause severe burns. Then advances in MRI. These are the latest changes in MRI, like diffusion weighted MRI for tumor cellularity and perfusion. Dynamic contrast enhanced MRI, DCE MRI, which is for tumor microvasculature. Now, diffusion weighted MRI and dynamic contrast enhanced MRI are the MRIs which are being used for detecting breast nodules less than 5 mm. So these are the MRIs which are being used for staging purposes recently. Magnetic resonance spectroscopy, they are being used for tumor biomarkers. Now this is bold MRI, blood oxygen level dependent MRI images, which deals with the deoxygenation, because even the deoxygenated blood, it also acts as a kind of it also has a magnetic field of its own. So you can read in detail. So that's why it is also a form of, it also has its own science. It also adds own science to it, and leads to bold MRI images. And then chemical exchange saturation transfer MRI. So difference in properties between tissues of different compositions. So we are going into a definitely a different world of MRI in another, maybe in another decade, we'll be dealing with with something totally different with what we are having right now. Father of CT scan, Sir Godfrey Newbold Hounsfield. He was born in UK. He was an electric engineer, and he won the Nobel Prize with Alan MacLeod Cormack in 1979. So we all know basic principle behind CT is that the internal structure of the object can be reconstructed from multiple projections. Functional CT, like functional MRI, we have functional CT. It measures the perfusion parameters. For example, in the A picture, we have seen the liver mets is there. And in the functional CT scan, we can always have the beautiful color pictures given to it, and we can measure the perfusion rate of that liver mets. And in the second picture, we have the FDG uptake shown. We can always have hybrid scanning, and we can measure the perfusion rate to that lung lesion. So what is the difference between CT or MRI? Now, this is the burning question, that when to go for CT or when to go for MRI. Imaging plane, see, imaging plane, we have to take CT in the axial plane. Whereas imaging plane in MRI, it can be any plane, and it can always be retrospectively reconstructed. Windows, we have brain window and bone window. And white and black, air within the sinuses is black. The brain parenchyma has a gray appearance and the skull is bright white. Whereas white and black here, same structure may be bright or dark depending upon the type of sequence. Like I showed you, axial, T1, T2. So it depends upon sequence or the flare sequence. So it can change any type. Hybrid scanning techniques. So image fusion and co-registration like SPECT-CT, PET-CT, PET-MRI. So why fusion? Otherwise, we were having very nice quality picture. Now, why go for fusion? Again, because we were wanting best of both the worlds. We want perfusion also, and we want anatomic resolution also. So that's why we want to go for fusion. Now, challenges in interpreting PET and PET-CT studies. Variable biological uptake. Now, what are the challenges we face when we are interpreting the fusion studies? Because, okay, we do PET-CT, okay, we do PET-MRI, but what challenges do we face? So first is that physiological uptake, again, the variability is there between CT and PET. Second, FDG uptake is related to inflammation and infection too. Third is occasional pre-malignant lesion might be there. For example, in tuberculosis, for example, pre-malignant lesion with a very small avidity might be there for FDG. Unusual tumor site, where you are not expecting it all. For example, a colon cancer with a very small metastatic lesion on the facial bone, mandible bone, where you were not expecting it all. Limited resolution of tumor sites, altered biodistribution of FDG, bone marrow activation. Usually patients who are on chemotherapy or post chemotherapy usually have their bone marrow activated. So now how do you take over on those patients? How do you get the reports done on those patients? Motion artifacts. So these things have to be taken in account. So better localization of activity to normal versus abnormal structure. Now this patient is an infiltrated mass lesion in the left upper lobe being evaluated for malignancy. It shows a left enlarged mediastinal node. This is the B picture is a transaxial PET scan, and now we fuse the image together and we see a metastatic node. But however, this biopsy came out to be TB. So that's how we kind of confuse in the fusion images. Challenges with hyperglycemia. Now, if a patient is on insulin, or if a patient had a candy bar, for example, this picture, the previous picture is of a normal patient, but the same patient who was nervous and had a candy bar. The second picture taken after PET, see how much the cervical node takes up. So this patient showed exaggerated actually the FDG uptake, and this was just a false study which could have been misinterpreted. And this is a patient of lymphoma actually. So these kind of things can be there and should be looked after very carefully. Now this is a challenge with brown fat. Usually what happens, this case shows the effect of activation of brown fat in a patient, and because of the brown fat activation, bilateral supraclavicular nodes have picked up the FDG. And we could have easily been confused with the supraclavicular activity take-up or bilateral supraclavicular nodes, and could have started on some kind of adjuvant treatment. But no, this was just mere brown fat. So all these things should be very carefully picked up on the scans and be understood. Challenges with uncommon secondary. For example, I told you on this patient that this patient was a case of metastatic colon cancer and had a facial or a mandibular bone secondary. So, how to look for it and how to go about it and what to expect when you're looking at these kind of images is very, very important. Invisible secondaries. Now, in the first picture, shows nothing, and I also don't have a clue what it was. But when you see the B picture, the CT scan, okay, you get to know that something is definitely there stuck to the iliacus bone. And then when you combine it with PET CT, then you find out that yes, psoas and iliacus muscle are definitely involved with the lesion. There is a metastatic lesion. So disadvantages of PET CT relative to PET. Now, what are the disadvantages of PET CT relative to PET, which are not there in PET only scan? So claustrophobia is there. Why? Because the PET CT, instead of a donut shape, it is a long tunnel shape. So patient has to go through the tunnel, and that's why patient experiences claustrophobia. Now, radiation dosimetry. There is a lot amount of radiation exposure, 5 to 10 times more. Whereas in only PET, it is 3 to 5 times than the background radiation. Technical difficulties are more prevalent in PET CT as compared to PET. If one machine is down, then for example, if one component CT is down, then the whole PET CT is down. CT based attenuation correction of PET limits the PET use. So these technical glitches have to be looked after when you are trying to write PET CT. So it's not an easy job when you are writing a fusion image. And what are the limitations of CT in PET CT? So CT scans actually have lower energy in PET CT. So they will give lower resolution as compared to CT only. Then intravenous contrast enhancement is not there. It is there only in one condition, when you are going to do a diagnostic CT only. Otherwise, you can't write IV contrast because it's quite dangerous. Oral contrast is also not allowed in PET CT. Then gantry cannot be tilted like in the ordinary CT for head and neck cancers. So if you are writing PET CT, be very careful whether you want to write CT alone or PET CT. Now, specifically, I would like to touch upon role in head and neck cancer. Staging in head and neck cancer covers most. Now, PET CT, if you're talking about, covers most of the body in a single frame. So this is a very good advantage of PET CT in head and neck cancer. Now, FDG PET and CT. Sensitivity of FDG PET is 87% versus 62% of CT. Specificity is also very high of FDG PET, 89% versus 73% of CT. This was in 2004. Primary tumor detection, again, PET CT is number 1, followed by MRI, and third place is of CT. Now, this is a nasopharyngeal carcinoma, again, with a small node and retropharyngeal node. And here you can see in the, it's actually the other way around. This was not very clear mentioned on PET scan. You can see PET has actually underscored our lesion and the node, which is very well enhanced on the MRI. So even these things also can happen when PET scan cannot give us the real picture or the real boundaries of our image, but it can be given by CT or MRI. So here again, we can see the nasopharyngeal carcinoma, a small node, and it is also seen on the MRI, and multiple chain of cervical lymph nodes can be seen. And here you can see the floor of the mouth. You can see the ventral surface, the oral cavity of the tongue. So detection of lymph, you can see detection of lymph nodes everywhere. HCT had the major accuracy of detecting the lymph nodes. So these studies were there between there was a competition, or you can say a comparison between FDG PET, PET CT, CT, and MRI. And everywhere it was shown that yes, PET CT, the accuracy was much more in detecting the lymph nodes. Now, what about occult nodes? Occult nodes, by occult nodes, I mean which are not there on any of the scans, and you are still suspecting because the disease is there, and in these kind of scenarios, the PET versus CT sensitivity PET was definitely higher, and PET CT they were also not accurate for occult nodal disease. Remember that. The second point I meant to say that PET versus CT, the sensitivity was higher, but the study when it was done to rate how many times when they were saying that yes, there is an occult node present, and the surgically it was opened up, but it came out to be as negative disease. So they were not accurate in detecting the occult nodal disease. But the underline or the crux of this slide is that only surgically or sentinel node biopsy can make out whether in the neck the node is negative or positive. If you have still not understood this, we can talk about this later, that even FDG and CT scan or MRI cannot detect whether it is a negative neck or not. Only surgically we can decide whether, by taking a sentinel node biopsy, that yes, it is a negative neck. Distant staging. Now PET scan has role in two conditions very, very importantly. If somebody asks you in head and neck region, in which two conditions are you going to prescribe PET scan? So one is to rule out distant staging, and second is to rule out synchronous primary. So one of the most powerful indication in head and neck is distant staging, and the other is synchronous primary. So here you could see in nasopharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma, a small hepatic secondary was seen on PET scan. So these are again the study which said that yes, PET was supposed to be having higher sensitivity for taking out the secondaries and the distant metastasis. Now, carcinoma of unknown primary. Cervical lymph node mets from unknown account for 1 to 2% in new cancers, in unknown cancers, and wide field irradiation basically reduces the risk of tumor occurrences, but also induces the xerostomia and other side effects. So for example, this patient presented with a node on the right side, but then when PET scan was done, it was found out to have bilateral tonsillar region disease as well as right side node. So these studies, which were evaluating 18F FDG PET or PET CT for detection of carcinoma of unknown primary with a negative workup. So these also went in favor of FDG PET. And similarly in recurrent diseases, in which the diseases were coming after radiotherapy, completion of chemoradiotherapy, for example, in the form of nodes or in the form of nodes only, yeah. We can confirm it in these scenarios also. We can use PET CTs and we can confirm the disease. And here also FDG PET and PET CT also went in the favor of finding out the recurrent diseases. So coming on to newer imaging technologies for cancer screening, we have positron emission mammography. So this is something like dynamic contrast enhanced mammography, which is going to detect tumors as small as 1 mm. Ultrasound and magnetic resonance elastography, which is also going to be applied to breast nodules. Optical, which is going to use invisible near infrared light and non-contrast optical imaging. Contrast enhanced optical imaging of tissue surfaces, virtual colonoscopy, and new imaging technologies for staging, for example, replacement of SPECT radio tracers with PET radio tracers in the form of indium 111. Time of flight PET. For example, in PET, we have seen that they catch the parallel going, uh, uh, the parallel photons. But here, what they're going to do is the ones which are coming back, they can catch them also. So this is going to measure the time difference, and they will be able to more precisely locate the position of the originating disease. This is going to basically increase the resolution. Then hyperpolarization MRI, and then something known as cancer specific targeting ligands. New imaging technologies for the treatment image guided chemotherapy, like our image guided radiotherapy. Then image guided ion beam radiotherapy. What we are doing in some countries like proton and carbon ion beam therapies, and image guided surgery. The only two imaging techniques used even occasionally are X-ray fluoroscopy and ultrasound. And at the end, I would just like to give the take home message as molecular imaging is definitely an indispensable part of radiation oncology. And but it's in some kind of double-edged sword. At one end, it definitely gives us an edge over the disease, that we know the disease, we definitely know the perfusion rate, we know the tumor proliferation rate, we know the anatomy, but we should not overestimate or we should not overjudge the disease that, but we should always have something at the back of the mind that we may be losing something or we may be missing something. Molecular imaging cannot replace clinical examination. This thing should be kept in mind very, very, very thoroughly by all the students who are listening to this message or to this lecture, that first of all, clinical examination is a must for all the students. And what we see today is just the tip of the iceberg. For example, the last few slides, last couple of slides which I have shown, even I was finding it quite difficult to understand what they are trying to tell us, because the way at the pace which they are going is quite is beyond comprehension. So what we are seeing today and what we are doing with our patients today in the diagnosis, in the diagnostic regions, is just the tip of the iceberg. And what we may be dealing in another 10 years will be beyond our comprehension. I just want to say that. So with this slide, I would like to end my presentation and over to Dr. Dodal. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I think you included topics which was like beyond my expectation. Just let us take a couple of questions first. First question is from Dr. Akshaya. What percentage of unknown primary we will detect in case of occult primary?
That's a very interesting question what Dr. Akshaya has asked me. See, Akshaya, when I was a student, then this question was asked to me very rampantly, that what percentage of occult primary will be detected by, what is the percentage of occult primary? I'm just trying to be little bit familiar that what do you think is the percentage of occult primary? Hello?
Dr. Akshay, are you listening? Yeah, please respond to my question.
30 to 40%.
30 to 40?
30 to
See,
30 to 40%, ma'am.
the occult primary is between, say, 8 to 10% only, according to books. But I would say it depends upon the consultant. Okay. If the consultant is good, he is going to find the primary. It happens very rarely that you are unable to find the primary. Okay, Akshaya, are you listening?
That's a
Yes, ma'am. I'm listening, ma'am.
that's a very important comment. So most of the time,
Listening, ma'am.
what happens when you are finding a node in cervical region and you are trying to find out a primary. So there are lists of investigations which you are supposed to do before actually saying that it's an occult primary. So after following all those, or after doing all those battery of tests, it hardly remains an unknown primary. That starts with your triple endoscopy. That has a lot of imaging, including CT scan, MRI, whole body PET scan. Then you are supposed to take random biopsies from oropharynx. And I really don't know how many of the centers are actually following all those investigation protocols before calling it an unknown primary. And I think Dr. Sapna has very rightly pointed out, it depends on the consultant. Coming to another question, Dr. Bivai has asked, so he has thanked you for your excellent presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Vibha.
The future of molecular imaging associated with infective genetics, especially HPV-driven head and neck squamous cell cancer.
Okay.
And the second question from him is also the role of hypoxia-driven molecular imaging, especially FASA and FMESO, and cellular proliferation-driven FLT PET. What are the future prospects?
See, Dr. Vibhay, first question is, can you explain the future of molecular imaging associated with infective genetics, especially HPV-driven? The role of hypoxia-driven molecular imaging, especially FASA and cellular proliferation during FLT PET. I think I will try to answer the second question. The role of hypoxia-driven molecular imaging, especially FASA and FIMSO, and cellular proliferation-driven. See, future prospects are in the trial, Dr. Vibhay. The role of hypoxia-driven, these FASA and FIMSO are, they are just trying to basically develop what I have also. I think I deleted few slides because of time consumption, that these are just trying to maybe promote hypoxia, decrease the hypoxia, and I think decrease the hypoxia, and I think, as Dr. Dodal was mentioning before, that in the hypoxic cells and in the cellular proliferation part, I think they are trying to do their best in PET scan. But I am not very familiar with the HP driven the head and neck squamous cell pathology. I might have to read it up. I think Dr. Dodal might help me out here.
No, I don't think I know too much about this.
Yeah,
only thing is this FMESO and this FASA or copper ATSM, they were all part of some study protocols.
Yeah, that's what I think of.
As of now, and mostly those studies were conducted in European countries, Nordic countries. I have not seen any routine utilization of those molecules in clinical practice. And to my knowledge, I don't know any center in our country using those molecular markers as of now for routine clinical use. But yes, they really look very nice and fantastic to based on their basic understanding and their basic mechanism, that you are actually identifying a focus of hypoxia in a tumor cells, and that will allow you to escalate the dose with the expectation that your dose escalation will be able to take care of that hypoxic component, which are usually a bit radio resistant. So the concept is you are detecting a hypoxic component which is radio resistant, and to overcome that radio resistance you will be able to dose escalate. So all these trials are usually associated with some kind of dose escalation protocol. Now FLT PET, yes, again you are having more proliferation, that indicates that the tumor is biologically more aggressive. So maybe you need to take into account some more factors for the adequate control. That might include some changes in your dose fractionation and also total dose. Now, regarding the future, it actually, I believe it's yet not that much explored area. So I hope the future will be bright if we can actually utilize all of these things. But that needs some systematic randomized trial to know the final outcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ghazal.
There are other question. Dr. Rakanuzzaman has asked factors resulting false positivity in PET CT scan.
See, false positivity, like I told you, that if a patient has diabetes, or like a patient had benign disease, for example, infection or any kind of inflammation, or any kind, for example, I showed you one picture where a patient had a candy bar, or a patient is nervous, then these kind of conditions are there where a patient can have a false high avidity or false reading of PET CT scan. Okay.
And if I remember during your talk, you correctly pointed out one of the very important factors, hyperactive cellular bone marrow, which happens very frequently during and immediately after chemotherapy.
Yeah.
So you can see a diffusely active bone marrow during chemotherapy, or if the PET scan is being done within 2 weeks of last chemotherapy dose. So that is one of the factors for false positivity. Secondly, again, yes, hypermetabolic state, or because the PET scan is basically dependent on glucose metabolism. So that's another factor. Infection. So false positivity, if you consider detecting cancer, then yes, presence of infection is one of the factors responsible for false positivity. But if you are not biased, then that's not a factor for false positivity. Finding infection is one of the indications for doing PET scan. We are not that much familiar because we are dealing only with cancer, but if you see the practice in community, people are actually using PET scan more perhaps than we use it for detecting malignancy.
Even brown fat activation also can lead to false.
Yes, absolutely correct.
Ma'am, I want to know after how many weeks we can prescribe, how many weeks of radiotherapy we can prescribe for PET scan. And actually I already known the chemotherapy and the radiation duration, madam.
3 months. After 3 months, we have to prescribe.
3 months. Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Dr. Rakanuzzaman, is your question related to response assessment, or is your question related to feasibility of doing PET scan after chemotherapy?
No, sir, it's a question of my response evaluation after chemotherapy and radiotherapy.
Okay. So yes, ma'am has correctly said it's 3 months. In few cancers, we can do earlier, like in case of lymphoma or lung cancer. But for head and neck cancer, which is our topic today, it's 3 months. So sometimes you can do earlier just to assess the response, but your decision should not be based on that scan. If you are doing a scan at 4 weeks or 6 weeks just to assess how well the tumor is responding, you can do that. That's outside protocol or outside recommendation, but that should not bias your decision. So for decision making, it's at 3 months when you see the residual node, and then you decide further treatment. Dr. Vivai has another question for you, Dr. Sapna.
Okay.
The difference between molecular based imaging and radiomics. That's a very interesting question. I think we should arrange one class of radiomics by Dr. Tejpal Gupta, and we can have a in detail analysis of that.
I was thinking about that because radiomics is a completely separate and a very elaborate chapter itself. And I think we can have a separate class, Dr. Vibhay. Is it okay?
I think it's okay. I happened to listen one of the classes taken by Dr. Tejpal Gupta in one conference, and it was excellent. the role
Yeah.
of radiomics in gliomas. That was really mesmerizing. So maybe we can request sir to take a class on that, because that class itself will take 1 hour or more.
Okay. Yeah.
Any further question from anyone?
Yeah, there's one more question, that does FDG uptake happens in necrotic tumors? So Akshaya, my answer would be that no, because necrotic tumor does not utilize oxygen and the metabolism is totally zero in necrotic tumor. So wherever there's no metabolism, the FDG uptake will not be there. Is it okay, Dr. Dodal?
Yeah, absolutely. Necrosis is not supposed to show any uptake. So you are seeing necrosis only. You can just get a peripheral ring enhancing area, which may be positive for FDG uptake, but the central part of necrotic part, they do not show any uptake.
Are there any more questions?
No, I think there are no more questions, and thank you so much for this in-depth discussion.
Thank you.
We'll request to share your slide if you don't mind.
Sure. And no problem.
That will be really helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you everyone. If you have any more question, you can actually put in the group also.
Okay, sure. Thank you everybody.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, have a great day.
Same to you.
Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.